Palingenesis by Simon Harewood. Book 3, Heart of the Sear. Chapter 1, The Destroyer. The slight figures of Brennick and his 3 companions lay concealed within a stone's throw of the wooden palisade marking the southwestern extremity of Grail. The sunlight seemed to linger among the tall ferns. It held back the chill already creeping up on them in the lengthening shadows of the Genesis evening. It was infinitely better in the woodland outside the city than in the tomb-like underground. All were eager to find their way back to the Vran hideout, yet the open air of the forest was a welcome respite after the 10 days of darkness in the tunnels below. Brennick nervously fingered the blade slung behind his shoulder. He had tied a strip of cloth around the beautiful glass hilt, in place of the leather that had formed the grip who knew how long before. The touch of it was enough to reassure him. He turned back to the others.
We have to wait for dark. There aren't so many torque about now. The others can't see well at night.
There were nods and more than one look of relief. They had not the nerve or the means to fight their way through enemy guards on the wall. The blades, apart from Brennick's and the wrapped-up prize Rin carried, had been left behind in the ghost cave. Once the twin star stared down at them with its overbright eyes, the boy set off for the wall in a single-file trot. A loitering guard had disappeared to the north moments before. They could still discern his hollow footsteps on the planks of the catwalk. Rin brought up the rear, hugging the wrapped blade to his chest, hardly daring to breathe. He could hear the swishing of the dried grass through which they were wading, the drumming of his heartbeat, the eerie calling of a wood owl. He was grateful for the dark shadow of the wall looming ahead, if they could get to it without being noticed. The boys started violently as something stirred in the grass ahead of them. They froze and squatted down as a small animal scurried away in the direction of the forest. Breathless moments passed. Would the guard turn around to have a look? Had he heard the noise at all? Furtive looks started from one to the other. Brennick motioned them forward. The deep darkness settled about them like a cloak. Tentatively, they touched the timber of the wall. It was 12 feet high, with sharpened points at the top and a slight overhang. Brennick put his back to it and beckoned for another boy to do the same. A third was helped onto their shoulders and placed his back to the wall in turn. Rin, being the smallest, was given the rope they had fashioned from their girdles to drop down from the ghost cave that morning. Carefully, he clambered upwards, helped along by the others, till he could peep through the V-shapes of the top. The catwalk appeared deserted. There was no illumination apart from the starlight playing over the sleeping city. He pulled himself up, his hands slipping horribly on the dew-wet wood as he passed over the spikes. Silently, his bare feet lighted on the catwalk. In a moment, he looped the rope round a spike and dropped it over the side. One by one, the boys climbed over, Brennick being the last, and tying the loose blade to the end of the rope to be hoisted up before he made the attempt. Once they had freed the rope, they slipped down the closest ladder to the street below. Rin followed behind the others again as they ran light-footed through the dark alleys. He gripped the blade as tightly as he could in his hands, till he could feel his own rushing breath and pulsing heartbeat in the solidity of it. It could not be far now. Would they be able to slip in unseen? Lund had said that the Keeper army was trapped underground, but there were hundreds still in the city. Would these not watch the entrances to the pits closely? He blundered into the boy in front of him. They had halted abruptly. Brennick turned and whispered urgently.
Hide!
There were voices now, and footsteps. A light appeared round the corner not 10 paces away. Rin looked about him frantically. Where could one hide? There was a shout from the keeper patrol, echoed oddly by Brennick.
Run!
The boys sped away, panic spurring them on. Ren ducked into a narrow street, realizing that he was separated from the others. He held the blade in one hand now. It was easier to run that way. The street turned ahead of him, growing narrower still. He splashed through a pool of rainwater. There were noises of pursuit behind. Around the turn, the roadway was blocked off by a wall. He stopped in confusion, looking about for a way out. Fear made it difficult to think. Behind him came the shout of challenge and the drawing of steel blades. Instinctively, he felt the debilitating terror of the tanning yard close in on him. Now, as then, the scream inside passed in silence, echoing in his mind alone. He thought of the blade and tore away the covering, but there was no reassurance here. The guards were too big and strong, and there were 4 of them. Then, as he cowered against the wall, powerless and afraid, a familiar thought reached out to rescue him.
Ren, what is the matter? Where are you? Have you been discovered?
Cool reason returned sufficiently for a quick reply.
Lund, we're almost at the arena. To the south, trying to get back to the pits. They're chasing us and we can't get away.
The running keepers were upon him. He thought of what Brennick had said. The others can't see well at night. Only one of the men carried a lantern. The structures on both sides of the alley prevented the starlight from reaching the street. He leaped forward, past the leading keeper, and struck the light out of the hand that carried it. There was a gasp of dismay as they were robbed of their sight. But the men were too close, all around him. An iron grip closed round his wrist. Other hands reached out to hold him, twist his limbs into submission, drag him away to that horrible frame in the shed. But he would not go, not anymore. Ren screamed and struck out with the blade. It was light and swift, cleaving through the night about him, a weight even his feeble strength could control. Through his anguish he thought what a beautiful sound it made. But there were other sounds now, screams of pain and anger. The hand on his wrist opened and he backed away, watching them stumble and curse, their arms and weapons sweeping the empty air. One of them doubled up in pain. The cold stone of a building touched his back. He turned and sprinted away. In the main street, the others stood waiting, an urgent whispered conversation among them. They turned to meet him and gripped his arms as he came up to them.
Where have you been?
Are you hurt?
How did you get away?
There were 3 of them.
His heart was light with relief.
4.
He said.
They're down there in the dark.
He pointed. Kevik did a little dance of excitement.
There were 2 after us, but they ran when they saw Brennick's blade. It grows longer, and there is a light in it, like Lund's.
The distant bark of orders interrupted them. Tramping feet were moving in their direction. The warriors Ren gave the slip appeared from the side alley. Almost at the same time, Lund's thought found him again.
Make your way to the arena. We will wait for you at the south gate. Hurry.
He needed no goading. He dragged Brennick by the arm even before he could relay the instructions. The keepers hesitated long enough for them to rush past towards the looming structure of the arena. There was trouble ahead. The fleeing boys could make out a clash of arms, sudden and stark, piercing the calm of the night. Torches flared, lighting up the high wall. A hunting horn brayed close by. Many feet were running to cut them off. Men, snarling and wild, were rushing in to spill their blood. Ren knew they would not escape this way. The servants of the Torque had overtaken them, would make sport of them before they were allowed to die. But from the dark curve of the wall came many more forms, silent, swift with spear and blade, breaking through the encirclement, cutting through the pursuers to form a barrier behind. The keepers halted in consternation. Horns bleated into the night. The slaves had dared to expose themselves in the city. Some, overeager or braver than the rest, rushed the barrier of blades. A fierce but short struggle followed. There was no penetrating the slaves' line. Wounded and bloody, the warriors fell back to wait for reinforcements. Satisfied that there would be no close pursuit, the slaves retreated swiftly, melting away into the dark. Only once the outer gates of the pits were barricaded behind them did Lund allow the pace to slow to a walk. The boys looked at him questioningly. Where were the Torque keepers? He halted to explain and let them catch their breath. Someone lit a torch. Lund looked the boys over for signs of injury while he related to them why the Torque no longer controlled the great court or the pits. In the flaring light, he noticed the blade in Ren's hands.
Why did you not let us know that you were coming in?
He took the boy firmly by the shoulders.
You should have told me earlier, Ren. It was dangerous for you to attempt us by yourselves. You were fortunate not to be caught and killed.
The boy nodded but held his gaze. Something of his former timidity had vanished. At once Lund knew what the change was.
You have seen him, the winged man.
The eyes widened.
I have seen him, and I know his name.
He has shown you a blade?
Yes, but it is not mine. We must go up the northern road. They are waiting for it there.
Urgency had crept into his voice. Memories of his dream were crowding in, potent and compelling. He trembled visibly.
They?
He nodded again.
I will know them when I see them.
Lund took the blade from the child and lifted it up to the weak lamplight in the passage. He noticed at once that the weapon was longer and heavier than his, with a different pattern adorning the molded hilt and finger guard. A single blue-white gem had been embedded in the pommel. There was a secret here. Beneath the glossy surface, a latent potency lay sleeping. For a moment he could taste the strain and burning hurt such unleashing of power inflicted on the body and mind. If one would attempt to wield this blade without the corresponding fortitude, the results could be devastating. No wonder the winged man matched the wielder and the weapon. Only a strong kinship between the exponent and the conduit could refine the flow of potential to a controllable level. There was no question among the surface garrison of Grail as to who would replace the fallen Lord Groth as commander. In fact, most of the men believed that Zabron had never really relinquished control. Perhaps he had been recuperating from the severe wounds he had sustained during the slave uprising, or perchance he had merely been biding his time, showing the Lord of the Tour just how different he was from the likes of the former chief overseer. It took more than muscle and brutality to subdue the scheming Viron dogs. Now he was back in the seat of power. Matters were sure to change. The long series of mishaps would come to an end. Zabron was not fooled by the show of skill and strength among the condemned slaves. They were a pathetic lot in reality. There was but one who held them together now. One champion kept up their courage, gave them hope and the will to resist. The youth he had stopped on the line so many seasons before. The old one who had almost broken his mind during the uprising was no longer a threat. In fact, Zabron was sure time had caught up with that hidden menace. There was no longer any hint of his presence in Grail. But the youth remained increasingly potent, gaining in confidence and experience. If he could be eliminated, the rest would no longer be a problem. For a moment he weighed the possibility of acquiring such potential. He had never consumed a Viron, despising the weakness of slaves. Could there be any virtue to be gained from such despicable creatures? But even the great Horan Indronog had desired to have this one. He smiled. How strange that it should be Zabron's fate instead, to claim the prize that had eluded a god. Yet he would have to capture this resilient slave leader first. By the evening of the day following Groth's demise, Zabron had sifted through the possibilities. The slaves had a way out of the death trap in which they found themselves. They no longer had to search for such a safe route that could lead them into the forest to make a last desperate bid for freedom. This was how they had managed their raid on the town, through the feeding pits. Groth had discovered it, but his overconfidence had killed him there. Nevertheless, the secret was out. Would they attempt to break out now that their escape route had been revealed? Certainly not. The pit entrance was barricaded in their feeble fashion. It would not withstand a serious assault. Their control over the pits had to be broken, of course. The greater part of his force was trapped underground and would soon be starving. The poor slaves could not keep him out. He did not need to break down their barred gates to gain entrance to the great court. They were aware of this, surely. He had descended into the chimney and to the very edge of their former stronghold, just after their daring raid on the town. The slaves would not have forgotten that. Something warned him, though, despite the reassurance of his terrible might, not to venture into the slave pits without support. No, he would distract them by assaulting the outer entrances with what remained of the Grail garrison, then surprised the guards in the court by himself. They would expect him to come through the opening in the court roof like before. Without doubt, the slaves would fall back to their new hideout, retreating through the Ronin pit. Then the trapped Southland warriors could be freed and a final onslaught planned. A persistent knocking broke through his contemplations. At the same time, he heard a horn sounding in the distance. The slaves were up to something again. This time he would strike them hard. Before morning, the great court was in Torque hands again. Berthael and the slaves guarding the chimney were ordered back as soon as the great beast was spotted in the night sky above. It descended swiftly into the narrowing funnel of rock, and the Vran had to scurry for the safety of the feeding pit tunnel. Here again they barred the gate, but the tunnel was too confined for the monster to follow them. It bellowed its rage after them, the reek of the belching fire filling the air in the tight space. And how their courage fled just to hear it, how their strength deserted them and all their hope evaporated. Lund sensed the return of the destroyer even before the ram of the Tor garrison crashed against their outer gates. He remembered the night of terror when the beast had caught them off guard, killing and maiming before they could escape its reach. There was no choice but to fall back to their hideout beyond the Ronin pit. They left the gate to the enemy and trotted down the ramp into the feeding pits. There was no facing the Torque while such overpowering force was ranged on their side. The beast would have to be dealt with, or they would all perish underground, and no one here was able to deal with it. They were all looking to him. He did not know whether the blade would be sufficient to kill the destroyer. Yet there was another time in the forest when he had had but a crude talon with which to overcome a mighty hunter. Perhaps the monster could be overcome in a similar fashion, if one but knew its weakness. He pictured again the armored malice he had seen in the forest. How was one to draw close enough even to strike a blow? Perchance the blade could penetrate the armored hide of the beast, but how would one survive long enough to make the attempt? A direct confrontation was futile. He had to find another way. Down they went, past the empty cages of the upper levels. Already he braced himself for the sight of the lowest feeding pit. The Ronin pit. Here was one place the horror of the destroyer found its match. If he could lure it down here... Slowly, regretfully, Zabran cloaked the ecstatic anger of his true shape. Around him still the violence raged as if reluctant to abate, stirring up the dust among the stones of the court, scattering the ashes of his spent form. How he abhorred the crippling of his power in this stifling frame. How he longed to be done for all time with the confinement of this mocking weakness. But he could not follow where the rebels had gone in that form. He would have to dig them out first, destroy their hiding holes, before he could face them in irresistible power. His warriors had worked their way through the makeshift barricades. Communications would have to be re-established with the hundreds trapped below before the miserable slaves could be forced to the surface. Rope ladders were lowered quickly and supplies brought in to revive the men. He would bring half of the more than 600 up again to secure the court. Would 300 be sufficient to hold the slave caverns down the chimney? That number would have to suffice. Resupplied and rested, the warriors would certainly hold off any slave attempt at dislodging them, especially if the tunnels were watched with care. Wherever the fleeing slaves had collapsed the roof to cover their escape, watchmen would be posted to report any effort to reopen the passage. The horde of Viron rebels would not escape through the caverns below. It would be the Ronin pit for them, or slow death in the underground. Lund leaned back against the cavern wall. The pale light of their makeshift torch washed over the faces round him. Brithael wore his pensive frown, as was his custom. Seritwin kept her gaze on the rocky soil at their feet, her long hair cascading over her shoulders and down her back. Lathan, old and frail-looking, sat next to Brennick, all youthful vigor and excitement, despite the narrow escape in Grail. All the eyes were gilt reflections of the fire. Lund's low voice seemed loud in the silent space.
We are truly trapped now. The Torque are aware of our only way to the surface. The warriors block our exit in the caverns, and the destroyer waits in the court.
He turned to Lathan.
How long will our supplies last?
The old man sighed mournfully.
Some stores were lost in our hasty removal from the chimney caverns. Even with near starvation rations, we will run out of food in a 10-day.
Brith shook his head at this.
That leaves very little time to dig our way out to the surface.
Lund nodded.
Too little. We will have to take the offensive.
All the heads turned back to him. Brith spoke for them all.
The offensive? How?
Lund's jaw was set in determination.
The beast has to be destroyed. There is no escape for anyone while it lives. We must do this or perish.
Lathan's voice was stark with resignation.
I have seen what power the blade has brought to you, Lund. I have not dreamed such things were possible as I have seen you perform. But the beast is beyond us. Even if we had a dozen of your potential, to confront it head-on is to throw away your life.
There was a tense silence as they waited for his reaction. Would he prove reckless now, risking all on one meager chance? Would the abandon they had witnessed during the engagement in the chimney cavern guide all his decisions? Slowly he shook his head.
I am inclined to agree with you. It would be almost impossible to get close enough to strike at it. We have to devise another strategy.
Brithael let out his breath and allowed himself a little smile.
You have something in mind?
Lund returned the smile.
There is but one way that I can see. We have to lure it into the Ronin pit, trap it there, and let the monsters out.
Seritwin spoke up for the first time.
The wheels for opening their cages are on the first level. And I thought you said...
Yes, the task will not be an easy one. First, we have to reach the wheels and defend them long enough to open the cages. Then...
He beckoned to Brennick. The boy looked at him eagerly. Lund was almost sorry for what he had to ask him.
Brennick, you remember the work we did on the cages in the feeding pits?
Yes, the chains and ropes for opening the doors.
I will need you and the other boys to go in there and hook up all the chains again. We will make strong hooks of metal beforehand. All you need to do is pass them through the chain links on top of the cages and connect them to the main line. Someone will have to climb up to the wheel platform. We cannot reach it by means of the ramp.
The boy seemed concerned now.
On top of the cages.
You saw me doing it, yes?
Yes.
Brennick did not add that he and Brith had both quailed before the task. Working so close to the caged demons had proved too much for their nerve. A single slip and the starving fiends would drag you through the bars. Perchance they could reach you even if you managed to keep your footing. Yet Lund had remained safe throughout the long hour he had clambered over these cages to loosen the chains. The beasts had not been able to touch him. Lund was speaking again, but he hardly understood the words.
Brennick, you saw what I did.
He nodded dumbly.
If you stay on the thicker crossbars, you should be safe. Take Rin and 2 others with you. He will have to let me know when you are ready. Take them up to the wheel with you. 3 should be enough to turn it, but you must wait for my signal. You can do all this?
Again the boy nodded. His mouth was set in grim determination.
I will try.
Brith was struck once more by the extraordinary courage of this young boy, who had shamed him once before into matching it with reckless deeds of his own. Now he felt the same strong urge force the words from his mouth.
Perhaps I should go with them.
Lund turned to stare at him.
I will need everyone in the pit, Brith. And if you are noticed on the cages, the trap will fail. There will be more than enough danger for those of us who have to lure the destroyer in. We will have moments only to escape the Ronings once they are released.
Berthael nodded silently. He realized full well what danger they would face. He remembered the fiery descent of the destroyer into the chimney and the destruction it had caused then. But now he also sensed the peril in which they would place Brennick and the other boys if the plan miscarried. Perhaps the warriors in the pit would be able to scramble to safety, away from the Torque henchmen and the beast, but the 4 on the cages would be trapped and killed or taken for certain. It was essential that they remain concealed. Sending more would endanger the mission unnecessarily. Lathan spoke up, giving the pensive group a start.
Where do you need the people to be?
Lund turned anxious eyes on him.
This is our last stronghold. If we fail in the pit, we will be rooted out or die scattered in the dark. Take little groups as far as we dare into the smaller tunnels. Conceal them as best you can. Provision them with what we have left. Perhaps some may survive to slip out when the Torque believe us all dead.
The morbid words cast a somber mood on all. They knew the possibility had to be considered, but talk of failure and death brought the horror of their plight close once again. Nothing remained to be said. The soldiers they had would be mustered for the demonstration they hoped would bring the Torque Master down to the pit in the morning. It was time to eat and take their rest. Lund watched them depart, their shoulders sagging with the never-ending burden, a shiver passing through the small figure of the boy. Seritman touched his arm.
The jewel that protected you from that spear. You wear it still?
He nodded.
Of course. It saved my life.
She hesitated.
There are many others. Some are similar to that one. They were set in metal frames long ago, and then embedded in leather or something like it. Perhaps they are to be worn together.
He frowned at her.
I feel it too. An urging, like the whispers of the mind. And I know things without understanding.
He shrugged.
There are secrets in these stones, like the fire of the blade, that we open with who and what we are. It could be that they will offer protection, like an armor of plate, but the one I wear goes with my blade and no other.
This is what I believe.
She held out her hand to show him 3 gems, one a little larger than the others.
These match the ones you have. And there is another like it set in a silver headband. But I do not know how one should wear them.
He peered at the jewels at length before slowly shaking his head.
I do not know either. If we had time, perhaps.
Brennick took many jewels back to the cave to hide them. Can we not send someone for them?
No, the beater force are between us and the cave.
She dropped her head. Her voice betrayed her concern.
You will face that monster without protection.
He placed his hand under her chin and turned her face up to him.
We will all face him without protection.
A sob passed through her body.
Yes, but the others will run.
Quickly, he drew her into an embrace. She was trembling violently.
What are you afraid of?
He whispered.
I will run also.
It seemed to be only a few hours later when he was roughly woken by a returning guard. There was activity in the large cavern off the chimney. Apparently, the beaters were digging away the rubble from the collapsed tunnels. Even with the haze of drowsiness still clinging to his thoughts, Lund realized that this had to be an attempt to divert their attention to the underground. The beaters could not seriously hope to reach the slaves through the narrows blocked with fallen rock and debris. They merely aimed to keep Thrawn warriors away from the feeding pit entrance. They were planning an assault elsewhere. There was no time to lose. He had the boy fetch Berthael and Lathan. While consuming a quick meal, the 3 confirmed the proposals of the day before. Brith had the 100 or so armed youths assembled at the feeding pit entrance. They could sally forth at a moment's notice. More stood ready to take their place and snatch up the weapon of a fallen comrade. There were miners in reserve to help bar the way if the warriors were overcome entirely. Lathan had 17 hooks for the occupied cages in the Ronin pit. They were crude, but seemed sufficiently sturdy to secure the door chains to the heavy main cable. There was no need to reconnect the lines to the empty cages. It would be heavy enough work to turn the wheel on the upper level without adding unnecessarily to the weight. The concealment of the remaining slaves would commence immediately. Family groups would receive their allotment of supplies and disappear into further, darker recesses of the underground maze. There, cowering in the shadows, they would await the outcome of the struggle in the feeding pit. Lund sniffed the air. The bear rock pressed coldly against his back. Every sense warned of the malicious threat lurking in the pits beyond the crude doorway. His eyes pierced the darkness beyond the pale center floor, where the bodies of former Master Groth and his warriors lay stripped and silent. There was more than the pent-up rage of the brutes behind their bars to challenge the reason and heart of any intruder into the Ronin pit today. Was there movement at the tall gates opposite? Shadowy shapes were lined up, pressing into the deep dark of the wall. What were they waiting for? Zabran could sense his prey from where he waited on the slope. Across the pit floor, lingering in a wall cavity, where a gap between two cages allowed access to the rock, the rebel leader was aware of him also. A slow smile spread across his face. At least the poor boy meant to put up a fight. There might be a little excitement after all, but he doubted whether this rabble could withstand the Southland warriors ready to invade their lost stronghold. It seemed unlikely that he would be forced to draw on his true strength. A pity. He glanced to his right. The eyes of all the men were fixed on him. They were eager to avenge their fallen master and comrades, eager to prove their worth against the stubborn slaves who had caused them such harm, such shameful setbacks. But with such a master as commanded them now, what had they to fear from the Viron children below? None could withstand the fiery potency they had seen descend into the chimney. Lord Zabran would take the slave champion and destroy him like a lamb. The wicked fire of his blade would not avail him. The Lord of Grail stepped out onto the sloping floor of the passage. He could feel the excitement on the other side of the pit as he strode forward, deliberately, to the tall gate. Behind him the rustle and scrape of armor and spear, not a whisper from his silent host, but a nervous intake of breath as dozens of red slits turned in their direction. He touched the cold iron of the bars, leaned against them, shoved the heavy gates out of his way almost disdainfully. Across the way he noticed the solitary figure stepping out of the shadows to meet him. It was arrogance, the blinding arrogance of his race, Lund realized, that would keep the mighty master unaware of the threat to which he exposed himself within this demented arena. Still, the trap was nowhere near a certainty. The destroyer and his forces would have to be occupied long enough for the boys to do their work. Now that the dark shape of his enemy was in plain sight, this task seemed most daunting. Silently, the slaves slipped out between the cages and onto the pit floor. The beater army shadowed their movements from the entrance. The Ronin stirred, their eager eyes flitting from one gathering group to the other. Lund strode forward to the border of the large oval stain of murky light that fell through the pits above to spread over the center of the Ronin floor. On both flanks, the spears of the Vran warriors kept pace with him. He was nervous, suddenly, for the fearsome strength of his opponent he had witnessed before, and he had no answer for it. There was snarling and hissing from the cages now. Rank upon rank of beater warriors filled the gateway third of the pit, their lines extending to the bars of the pens on either side. Ronins near the men were agitated, rattling their chains, beating at the bars. The beaters rolled their eyes and kept their distance. The hosts faced each other, the rising excitement among the Ronins tearing at their resolve. A voice rose above the din, reaching from the entranceway, cool and commanding.
Slaves, submit yourselves and your lives will be spared. You have no hope to resist me. Every last one of you will perish. Lay down your arms and we will allow you to come back into service. You can be free of these dark caverns once more.
It was a lie. They all knew it. Not the slaves stirred at the words. Did he take them for complete fools? Lund sent his thought to Rim. The game was on. The Torque host, at a signal, slammed their spears on their shields and let out a shout. As if in answer, a larger Ronin bellowed behind them. Lund drew the blade, his heartbeat quickening painfully. His warriors were better equipped than before, having pillaged shields and armor from Groth's fallen men. They closed their ranks now, holding their spears at the ready. There were 3 enemies for every one of them. The blade extended slowly in the ghostly light. He felt the heart of it stirring, eager. The potency there reassured him, emboldened him. He did not have to slay the monster, only force him to take his true shape. Brannick almost cringed away at the touch on his arm. The hand belonged to Rin, whose body was besmirched with greasy soot from head to toe, a hopeful disguise against the piercing gaze of the Torque Lord. They exchanged a nervous look from one finger-lined dark face to another. A quick whisper, and they were off. Brannick led the way. There was a strange ache in his limbs, as if the near passing of blood could cause him pain. He glanced at the cage they had to scale. His fingers were clumsy and slow, his stomach a knot of fear. The creature within was facing away from them, entranced by the numbers of men in the pit. If only it would not notice them. He gripped the bars overhead, struggling against his terror. His toes found the support of a crossbar, and he drew himself upwards. The battle cry from the beater host almost made him lose his balance. Yet he was grateful for the din, since the hooks in his girdle jangled together as he swung a knee over the top bars to gain the roof of the cage. He froze at the noise and glanced furtively in the direction of the beast so close at hand. It was quivering with excitement, its claws scraping against the metal bars. If it should turn... Brannick forced his eyes away from the curved spine and scaly hide. He brought his other leg over the edge to squat on the roof. The heavy chain lay right in front of him. He felt for the first hook without taking his eyes off it. A mighty cry erupted from the gathered warriors in the pit. The flash of arms and shouts of crazed men followed in wave after deafening wave. The beast below him screamed in violent harmony, and he felt the ferocity of it shaking the bars beneath his knees. The reek of its hatred and murderous rage welled up into his nostrils, till he could do little but cling to the rock wall, closing his eyes against the horror. Something touched his back, and he screamed also, though the sound of it was lost in the mayhem around him. He turned to strike insanely, the hook in his hand preventing him from reaching for the blade. The blow missed the struggling form behind him by inches. It was Rin, his face showing the same despairing terror dragging at Brannick's limbs. For a moment his expression showed surprise, and astonishingly Brannick felt the slight sting of embarrassment. It brought him to his senses. He gripped the younger boy's arm and drew him to the wall. They were close enough to exchange a hurried whisper.
Stay close. It hasn't seen us yet.
Rin pointed with a shaking hand.
It can get us through the bars. No.
Brannick knew the other was right but would not admit it. He hooked the chain into place. Across the gap he saw the 2 other boys were on top of the cage opposite. They were as petrified, but had already passed the hook through a chain link.
Come on!
Lund sensed early on that the struggle in the pit would be ferocious. The beaters were greatly emboldened by the presence of their lord, whose potency they had witnessed days before. With such a one at their backs, ready to intervene on their behalf, they did not contemplate retreat. Their victory over the rebels was assured. Yet the slaves fought with more valor still, for they had so much more to lose, even while they knew that this was not a battle to be won by force of arms. Ere long Zabran noticed this and puzzled over it. The Vran were holding back, fighting defensively, forcing his men to take the risks. Was it a strategy they had concocted beforehand? Did they mean to wear out the superior numbers in this enclosed space? Had they another hidden scheme to avoid their doom? He glanced round the cavern, suddenly suspicious. The beasts all around were restive, snarling and beating with their twisted wings, adding to the ear-splitting din. How he detested them, these perversions. When the slaves were overcome, he would burn out this filthy nest and be done with it. Something moved on top of the cage. He fixed his eyes on the far wall, irritated by the curtain of dim light between. But the slaves tried to outflank him by crawling. A flash of blue brought him back to the arena. The slave champion had joined in the struggle at last. Zabran marveled at the sight. The youth strode through his host like a reaper in a field of wheat, felling the seasoned warriors before him in swathes of burning death. Behind him, the Viran surged forward, shouting at the sight of their champion. Could this boy turn the tide single-handedly? His pulse quickened at the possibility, and the press of excitement intensified throughout his body. His lips twisted into a crooked smile. Lund prayed that Brennick and the others were close to the completion of their task. He had had to commit himself, or the slaves would have been driven back onto the cages behind them. The enemy force was too potent to hold back for long. Through the madness and the exhilaration of his dancing blade, he glanced at the stationary figure in the gateway opposite. How long would the destroyer linger there before he waded into the battle? Brennick was whispering to himself.
You will see the world outside the forest. You will see it, and the others who are free. You will see them. You will not die here, eaten by these.
He drew in his breath and let it out slowly, his eyes overlarge and his gaze darting from side to side, as if a stare alone could ward off the threat below his bare feet. The last hook was securely in place. Rin was on his heels as they made their way back to the scaffolding that would bring them to the wheel platform high above. There was a hissing thing in the cage right below it, with a long serpentine neck. It was sniffing the air as they clambered over the roof of its cage and turned to look at them. The scream was enough to throw them off balance. When its hurtling body smashed into the bars behind them, the boys lost their footing and were brought down on all fours. Frantically, they scrambled for the wooden beams of the structure, their minds awash with what should happen if they put a foot or hand through the bars. Terror sped their way up the trellised scaffold. The strain of the climb is nothing compared to the threat of the demon below. The sounds of the battle, oddly echoing in the hollows of the pit, urged them on as well. The slaves would be overcome soon enough if they could not bring the Ronings into the fray. 30 feet from their goal, both boys were startled by the whistling sound of missiles speeding past. They hesitated, staring at each other. Another object hurtled past. There was someone above them, perhaps on the platform, launching shafts at the rebels below. Brennick glanced back into the pit. Would the other boys follow them? Could they summon aid from the mad struggle down there? It seemed impossible. They would have to make the attempt by themselves. He touched the crook of his blade and motioned to Rin. They would work their way around to the far side of the platform before ascending. Whoever was on top would have to be taken by surprise. Rin made his way painfully after Brennick, gripping the rough wood till his fingers hurt. A nervous ache flowed through his innards every time he looked down. It took all the will he could muster to keep up. The urgent message from Lund invaded his thoughts at last, frightening in its intensity.
Are you on the platform? Have you reached the wheel?
Lund was straining for control. He could feel it. The battle had to be at its climax.
We are here, but there are men on top.
He could feel the desperation in the reply.
You have to take the wheel or we are all lost. Tell Brennick the hooks are in place. We need the wheel. Let me know when you have it.
Ren cringed inwardly. How were they to do it, just the two of them? He touched Brennick's arm and whispered the instruction. There was no time to think of failure or fear. Over the side they had to go to confront whatever stood in the way of deliverance. Lund felt the strain of the blade's demands on his mind and body. He held back for a moment to assess the situation. The Beater army had been driven back, fear of facing the champion having disrupted their formations and sapped their resolve. Perhaps a third of their number had fallen before the slaves' onslaught. Many more nursed light wounds or stood panting for breath in the heavy air. Among them, heads were turning towards their silent master, a sure sign of their weakening morale. Zabrin saw the change overtake his warriors till they were on the defensive, slowly retreating towards the gate, their courage wavering before the persistent rebels. It was true. A single slave could turn the tide of battle. The champion was too much for the Southland cohorts. The great lord of Nunmerik had been right then in desiring the essence of this particular Viron. The very thought of such potent prey within his reach sent a shiver of excitement through his frame. He exulted in this opportunity to steal the meat of a king, a god, and advance himself at the cost of his rivals who had certainly celebrated his demise by now. Oh, would there be many more such Viron champions? Would there be a setback for the tour host? Zabrin might still be of value to his disdainful master. The silent Lord of Grail stirred himself at last. His host was beaten, cowed, and fearful, retreating to the base of the ramp. It was time to put an end to the annoying resistance. There was no time to be afraid. Brennick, silently as a cat, brought his soot-smeared body over the edge of the platform behind the beaters. There were only two, left there perhaps to watch the exit, stealing forward to the wheel platform to do what mischief they could from above. Cowards, he thought, and this gave him courage to act. Rin would be little use in the fight, but he waited till the other boy had crawled through the rough railed support before drawing his blade. The silent stirring as it expanded brought one of the men's heads round. He saw the surprise and fear written on that face, then he leaped forward, intending to cut the fellow down before he could grasp his weapon. A shout escaped the beater, who tried to block with his bow. The blade sliced through it, leaving him staring at the stump in dismay. He was quick to recover. Jumping forward towards the boy, he gripped the sword arm of the latter with both hands, bringing his weight to bear. Rin closed in on him, sinking his long knife into the man's shoulder. The beater's mate, unable to see the assailants clearly, believed they were about to be overwhelmed by rebels. He dropped his bow and sped away to raise the alarm. Brennick strained with all his strength against the fearful grip. The beater yelled as he was struck by Rin and turned away to deal with a new threat. He gripped the smaller boy by the throat and reached for his own dagger. Brennick did not hesitate. It was shockingly easy to thrust the blade through the leather armor, through the muscled body, and see the heavy form crumple to the floor. Quickly, he turned to the wheel. Rin stood by, shaking, holding his throat and staring at the body. He had dropped his knife. Brennick whispered urgently.
Tell him we have the wheel.
There was little response. The eyes turned on him, the boy's breath came in quick gasps. A shout rose up from the direction of the upper passageway. The beater had found more of his kind to aid him. Brennick felt the panic of earlier wash over him. He glanced away to the ramp. There was no one in sight as yet. Quickly, he gripped the other boy's shoulder and shook him violently.
Rin! Tell him we can't stay here.
Zabrin waded through the failing warriors, down into the arena, among the cages of the waiting beasts. The nervous calm descended on the struggling men. The slaves hesitated at last, uncertain. His own men drew back from him. The dread of his approach outweighed their fear of the enemy. Even the slave champion had halted, the pool of pale light behind him. The blade was a living thing in his hand, a warning not to be ignored. The din of the battle diminished. Even the monsters settled into a watchful silence, their bodies quivering with expectation. All the eyes were fixed on him. They knew what he was. His feet touched the blood-stained soil, and he felt the revulsion rising up in him like a swampland vapor. The pit was a place of shame, a darkness to be cleansed by fire, cauterized and forgotten. This was where old Ishtar and the many lords before him had confined the twisted failures of the path. Careless or weak, it mattered not. They were not destined for greatness like he was. They had compromised, lacking the true dedication their chosen purpose demanded. Now they were nothing but an abomination, the disgusting reminder of the irreversible perversion into which one could fall. The rebels were reforming their line, gripping their spears nervously, their chests heaving still from the exertion of their struggle. He was painfully aware of the quick beating of their hearts, of the vulnerable life so close. Irresistibly, the great appetite within him took possession of his thoughts. There was no longer any choice. The mask of flesh would slip away, and he would be free of its crippling hold, its impotence. A sigh of abandon and ecstatic release escaped him. Lund felt again the petrifying terror that had gripped him in the tree. In front of his eyes, the air stirred into murky eddies of smoke and dust. The clotted floor, saturated with the blood of man and beast, fragmented now by this horrible power, swirled about the Torque Master, obscuring him from view. The moment had arrived. The destroyer was in the feeding pit. Where was Rin and Brennick? Had they failed? Had the beaters on the platform proven too strong for them? He remembered Berth's request to accompany the boys. It seemed to be wisdom now it was too late. All activity in the pit ceased, save for the sickening swirl of dust. Lund reached for the mind of the boy, Rin, but sensed nothing more than paralyzing fear. Fear that threatened to take hold of his limbs too. Around him rose the cries, the roars of rapture and loathing, drawn out, never ending. The Ronings pressed against their cage bars, drawn into the sorcery, the corruption of nature and form, in such potent perversion, and yielded their voices till the pit was filled with deafening clamor, tearing at the reason of men, drawing the flames of the beater torches this way and that. Rennick sensed the change, even while struggling with his petrified companion. All the horror of his short life leaned down on him, engulfed him like a night fog, impenetrable. He could feel the jarring of it like a physical force, drawing out all resolve and urgency. This would be his end. Fear had taken form, and he could not resist it. Horrible screams erupted from the dark hollow beyond the platform, breaking through his stuttering thoughts. He released the silent Wren, who dropped to the floor, clutching his knees, and looked over the rail. Far below, in the deep well of violence and anguish, he could see the forms of the other boys leaping from cage to cage to find their way back to the entrance. Torque hirelings and slave rebels alike, mortal enemies but moments before, forgot their struggle instantly. The wave of fierce hatred, the threat of nightmarish violence washed over them, though there was no thought but survival, the mad flight from the pit that might save their lives. A shadow moved among them, deliberately, scattering the feeble shapes of men wherever it went. There were no flames as yet. It was toying with its prey. One form remained defiant. The slave champion stood resolute, waiting, his blade a beacon in the murk. Desperation gripped Brennick's heart. Lund would be overwhelmed, and for nothing. He turned on the groveling Wren. His blade touched the boy's bare arm, drawing blood. For a moment reason pierced to panic. Questioning eyes were raised to his. He cried out as loudly as he could. Against the throttling terror, the running feet of the approaching guards, the fierce beast below.
Tell him! Tell him now! And help me with the wheel!
He aimed the blade again as if in threat. Wren swallowed hard and rose to his feet. He closed his eyes and pressed his hands to his ears to shut out the distracting clamor. Lund was there, strong but wavering, almost resigned.
We have the wheel.
The sobbing thought fell away from him into the well beyond. A reply, startling in its intensity, found him immediately.
Open the doors!
Hope flared up inside him. The screams of pain and death retreated. Brennick was at the wheel. Slicing through the rawhide knot, he motioned to Wren with his head. The wheel was as tall as he, heavy and intimidating behind. Could they even move it? A missile whistled past them from the running guards. They gripped the spokes frantically, hanging on them with all their weight. The wheel moved a few feet, tightening the ropes drawn through the pulleys, and stopped. They had not the strength to budge it. Lund gripped the blade in both hands. Chaos reigned all around the pit floor. The servants of the Torque themselves recoiled from the horror that was their master. The Franz slaves, save for a pocket here and there, had lost all control, and were scampering for the exit lane between the Ronin cages. No one could face such a demon and hope to survive. The madness of battle had faded from his mind almost completely. This was no time to give in to it. He had to remain in control, lucid and calculating. Any moment now the gates would open, and he would be able to make his escape. Any moment now. Lund stood alone in the center of the pit, the dust and broken bones of countless creatures about his feet. There was no retreat until the Ronings were freed, till the destroyer had no way to escape. The great beast noticed him, turned its head from the pursuit of the running slaves, and prepared to rush him. Behind it, he was dimly aware of the ranks reforming, the beater warriors reinforced and advancing from the gateway. Why would the cages not open? Had the boys been overcome? He would linger as long as he dared, as long as there was hope that their plan would succeed. He searched for the means to strike a single blow of sufficient potency to hurt the monster, but there was opposition now, from the crowding beasts about him, from the desecrated soil, from the growing fear inside him. All these struggles, all these fierce resistance, the many impossible escapes, all these had delivered him to such a moment. He could almost sense the thoughts of the departed core. This is what resistance means. This moment you see how futile it is. The great shape, uncoiled from the dust, with the smell of the pit about it, drew itself up till it towered over him. Run. He had to run and save himself. Rennick turned away to face the oncoming soldiers. A sob of despair broke from him. 5 men, spears leveled, one more, hastily fitting an arrow to his bow. It was impossible to face so many. There was no more time, and the wheel would not yield.
Stay back!
He screamed in anger and desperation, and his anguish stirred the blade into amber brilliance. Incredibly, the men hesitated, already on the catwalk. They could not have understood his words, but a sudden burst of illumination gave them pause. The small Viron was undoubtedly dangerous. They had seen what the blade could do. To their astonishment and alarm, he advanced on them, and they leveled their spears, a barricade of sharp steel beyond which he could not possibly reach. The bowman readied an arrow. Ren's repeated cries behind distracted the rushing boy, and the sight of the spear tips sobered him till he halted, breathing heavily, uncertain.
The ropes! Cut the ropes!
At last he understood the shouted instruction. Thick twisted ropes held the gangway aloft and connected it to the platform on which they stood. The guards were on it still, hesitating. It was an opportunity. He lost no time. The first one separated after a single blow, throwing the guards off balance. He turned on the other, the smell of the seared fiber sharp in his nostrils. The bowman loosed his arrow, and he knew it could not miss at this range, even though he had his side to the man. The tip entered his free arm before he could move to dodge it, passed through and pinned it lightly to his ribs. It had been a hasty shot and did not have the full force of the bow behind it, or the arrow would certainly have penetrated further. Rennick stared at the feathered shaft, the shock of it robbing him of motion. He felt suddenly dizzy, certain that the wound was mortal. Lifting the blade high, he took a stumbling step towards the other rope. The guards were shouting, fearful. One tried to crawl back to the ramp behind them, but the gangway tilted even more, till they had to hold onto the planking not to slip away into the darkness below. The boy hacked at the rope, their panicky cries in his ears, struggling against the burning in his arm and side, the warm flow of blood down his leg. The violent motion freed the tip of the arrow from his ribs, and he gasped in pain and relief. The missile had pierced his arm and not entered his chest. 2 blows and the rope came apart, the weight of the guards snapping the last strand. Their hollow screams ended abruptly. For a moment he heard nothing but his own gasping breath. Ren was shouting again. He turned to look.
Help me!
He had a rope in his hands, and he was struggling with the body of the guard they had felled by the wheel. Was the man not dead? Why would he want to tie him up?
What are you doing?
I have him tied to the spokes. We'll drop him over the edge and use his weight to turn the wheel.
Rennick understood. If the guard's body could start the wheel turning, they might be able to keep it going. Together they shoved the body to the edge, under the rail, and reached up to grip the spoke handles. It's too late, Lund thought. Too late to run. The beast could reach him with fire, or be upon him with a single beat of his huge wings. Somewhere in his benumbed mind rang the words of Ceridwen.
You will face the monster without protection.
He was exposed now, as she had predicted. His hope and indecision that kept him here. Even the inhuman potency of the blade seemed far off. He was deserted by all, finally the sacrifice. A great roar rose from the Ronings, filling his perception, driving out fear and speculation, till he could stand free and unflinching. Even the mighty destroyer was given pause. This, then, was the dark music of death, and he had no answer to give it. Yet the beast lingered, twisting its long neck to the side. He followed its gaze and gasped. Masked by the rising clamor, the rumbling of the opening cage doors had gone unnoticed. All round him the roaning pens were yawning ever wider, and the horrors inside pressed forward with frenzied appetite. They were ravenous and starving, blood-crazed, having witnessed the spilling of blood again and again in their domain, yet excluded from the rewards. The destroyer realized the threat and stirred its wings. Almost regretfully, it hesitated, glancing back at the slave champion within its reach. The hesitation was a fatal error. The explosion of violence shook the ground of the field. Mayhem engulfed the hundreds in their reformed ranks, and the semi-dark erupted with a tearing rage of the abyss, swallowing the pitiful wails of the doomed. Lund was stirred to action at last, stumbling, crawling, scrambling away. Though he knew there was no place of safety now, he was heady with elation and terror, the blade forgotten in his feeble grip, searching for a gap among the writhing, massive bodies. A claw raked his shoulder, jaws snapped shut close behind. The foul, putrid breath washed over him. He stumbled again and fell full length, crouched, rolled over, the evil dust in his eyes and nostrils. He had plunged into death, suffocating, and there was no way out. Brith tried to flatten his body to a space of bare wall between two empty cages. He was close to the cavern exit, but the beckoning haven beyond might as well have been on the other side of the feeding pit. The bravest of the rebels, the ones who had lingered to aid Lund to the last, were cut off and scattered, crawling, hiding in the shadows, desperate not to be noticed. The carnage was unbelievable. Finally, the dark threat he had sensed whenever he entered the pit found expression in front of his eyes. The marching enemy host disintegrated in moments. Their feeble attempts to resist the charging beasts merely fueled the ferocity of the onslaught. There was no stopping the Ronings. Nothing could intimidate them or tear through the madness of their blood rage. In their starved state, they would perish rather than be restrained. A bellow, like the rumbling of thunder, turned all eyes to the center of the pit. The destroyer threw back its head disdainfully, scorning the power of these brutes, the weak minds of his race, overcome through uncontrolled appetite. A billow of searing heat spilled from its open mouth and nostrils, scorching everything in its path. Two Ronings caught in the blaze screamed like oversized hogs, their twisted wings smoking as they tried to shield themselves. Involuntarily, Brith let go the bars of the cage and brought his hands to his ears to shut out the horrible noise. He crouched down as if to be swallowed by the crusted floor, his senses reeling. The air turned to raving violence and a terrific din rose from the Ronings. Turning from the broken men, they rushed to fall upon the spectre they hated without reason or limit. The fiery gaze of which would call them to account for deeds no longer remembered or understood, and he scorned them and reeled about with power beyond their grasp. He mocked their anger and their pain, even as he strove to end it. He remained within their domain, dealing death and destruction, ignoring the closing circle, the snapping fangs, till all chance of escape was gone, and he would conquer them or be overcome. Brith could not tear away his eyes. He knew that this was the time to run, to escape into the caverns beyond, but the heaving, struggling forms mesmerized him. The noise was terrific, beyond what nightmares had suggested heretofore. Yet for all its ferocity, the clash did not last long. The destroyer, arrogant and overconfident, disappeared beneath the terrible onslaught and did not rise again. Triumphant bellows filled the air. The master was no more. His irresistible power was broken. At least 4 carcasses littered the blood-soaked ground about the body of the great beast. The Ronings that remained seemed to gain new vigor from the demise of their would-be executioner. They turned about to search the cavern for any lingering threat. At last, Brith stirred to action. Here and there a wounded slave crawled along towards the safety of the pit exit. The gate opposite had been shut by the fleeing beater army. The ground in front of it was a mess of bodies and abandoned arms. Here, too, the wounded moaned and attempted to drag themselves away from the madness. Brith gripped his spear in one hand and, keeping close to the cage bars, made his way back to the exit. A slave, his back slashed open from shoulder to hip, struggled to his feet just ahead. As he reached down to help the boy, Brith became aware of a Ronin, smaller than the others, preparing to leap upon them. He grasped the spear in both hands, driving the butt into the ground. Before he could draw breath, the horror was on top of him, the smell and the bulk of it overwhelming, suffocating. Somewhere a blue brilliance flashed through his terror, and the roar died in his ears. The weight was upon him, however, pinning his legs, and he called out in agony. It was Lund's cerulean blade slicing through the carcass, till the stink of burning flesh and bone overpowered the reek of the beast so close to him. A blood-covered hand reached out to him. He gripped it and dragged himself free. Someone was shouting, but he needed no goading. He was running, stumbling for the far wall in safety. 3 of the Ronings turned to pursue them, their chains rattling as they leaped. For a moment he thought they would get away. The passage beckoned, eager arms reached for them. A terrific blow struck him from behind, knocking the breath out of his body and sending him flying. He was only dimly aware of the dusty ground coming up to meet him, of the dull roar of voices strangely distant, before the darkness overtook him. Someone was sobbing close by, and there was a pressure on his arm. His sight cleared sufficiently to see the wounded boy from earlier ineffectually dragging on it. Where was Lund? Had he been taken? Brith looked up, past the exhausted slave, towards the exit. They were close to it, but far enough for the others to stare and hesitate, to call encouragement and hang back in mortal fear. He looked behind. Why would the Ronings not claim their prey? A huge beast was blocking the way into the narrow passage, itself too large to enter. It was completely lost in its terrible rage, beating at the cages with claws and wings, barring the others from gaining access. He had to crawl away before it tired, before the others could slip past it. But his body was much too heavy. There was no strength in his limbs. Even rising up on hands and knees was beyond him now. Brith lay stretched out full length, waiting for death to claim him, the smell of blood and naked fear swirling all around.